So welcome to those who are just joining us, and good wishes for 2024. I hope it's started well for you and will bring opportunities for positive developments in your own life and work, as well as positive change in the UK and in the world. So thank you for joining us to discuss community security, overcoming a politics of exclusion, which is the third webinar in our Reclaiming Security series. For those of you who are not familiar with Rethinking Security, we're a membership organisation, and our members all work for different approaches to security that are based on sustainability, inclusion, equality and justice, challenging the primacy of so-called national security thinking. And this series of webinars over the winter is preparing us for the launch of our human security strategy for the UK, the culmination of a 3-year research project called the Alternative Security Review. And this evening, we're privileged to have with us Lorraine Mapinella, Leila Etohaj, and Reem Abu Hayeh. Before they speak, I'll introduce each of them a little bit more, but I'd like to welcome the three of you now and thank you for speaking to us tonight. Many of our members and supporters, and those of you watching this, work on global peace and justice issues, and it's very clear that the same national security that we challenge in foreign policy also produces policy in the UK that identify and target communities as threats to security, and that this simply creates exclusion and injustice. So it's important for us to understand the connections between that global foreign policy and security policy and the local impacts of those dominant ideas within the UK. These are issues of equality and justice, and we thank our speakers for joining us to say more about that after the first two webinars, which covered global human security topics. And I hope we'll leave this session with a greater understanding of what needs to change within the UK and how that might happen. So I'm going to hand over to Lorraine in a second, who'll be our first speaker, and then she'll be followed by Leila and then Reem. And after our speaker's contribution, there'll be plenty of time for questions. We're in webinar mode on Zoom, so please do use the Q&A box for your questions at any time, which we'll then come to in the discussion time towards the end. So I hope that all sounds fine. So Lorraine Mapinella is a Malawian-born and raised activist currently living in Coventry in the UK. She's a mother, a migrant rights campaigner, and a writer. Lorraine is the ex-chair for Coventry Asylum and Refugee Action Group, a self-organised group for and by people seeking asylum and migrants with precarious status. She's also one of the ex-co-chairs for the Status Now for All campaign. She's the author of I Was Not Born a Sad Poet, a poetry book that gives voice to asylum seekers whom we usually don't hear from. So I'm going to share Lorraine's website and new book in the chat, but thank you to Lorraine for joining us tonight. I'm sure many people here are not unaware of the onslaught of government policies designed to make life difficult and, in fact, unbearable for migrants with precarious status, and the harsh treatment of asylum seekers in particular over the last year. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say about how this links to dominant ideas about security and how we can work to overcome that kind of exclusionary politics. So over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, John, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Lorraine. I'm originally from Malawi. I've been in this country for 15 years. Between 2012 and 2022, I lived in limbo, 7 years of which as an asylum seeker. When I was born in Malawi, I was born 10 years after we got independence from Britain. We expected to live in a more secure environment, but instead, the gap between the most wealthy people and the poor people has just gotten bigger and bigger, and the debt has also increased. In Malawi, I was born in a rural part of the country, but when I grew a little bit older, I moved to the city in search of a better life. I migrated. So people migrate to seek opportunities. It is within us as human beings. looking for a better life, as well as looking for a place which is safe from persecution, as well as war. And there is no law that says do not move. So no matter amount of the army or the police that we may have, or the border controls that we may put everywhere else, that will not stop people from migrating or moving. Mainly because that does not address the main cause. The main cause are the inequalities in various parts of the world. If we had opportunities, nobody would be thinking of crossing the sea. I live here in the fifth richest economy in the world, but homelessness, sofa surfing, and relying on the charity of others is the order of the day. When I lived in Limbo, all of that happened to me. And asylum seekers are depicted as a threat instead of being a humanitarian issue. We are seeing detention centers, and quoting from the statistics from June 2022, they said 24,004 people were detained under the immigration powers, most of whom were asylum seekers. We are not allowed to work. If you work, you are criminalized. We are told we are liars if we try and speak up. I have been called illegal. How on earth can a human being be illegal? Arriving by boat is also a security issue, and hence we want to relocate asylum seekers that come here by boat. And we are relocating them in the global south, where the refugee issue is already also big. They are dealing with a lot of refugees. So sometimes we ask ourselves to say, what would make a country like Rwanda to agree to take refugees? Has it been bribed? People in this country, we are also waiting for a very long time for a decision. And this is due to the backlog that has been created because of lack of personnel. We feel stuck. So this is a quote that one of my friends said, who has been here for 23 years, but still he hasn't regularized his status. He said, although I bleed, but I'm not human. I only walk at night because I know the importance of exercise, but I don't want anyone to see me. I'm a prisoner. My friends can't recognize me because I have become unrecognizable due to my both mental and physical health conditions. Even if they recognized me, living without status, nobody takes you seriously. I tried to submit my application and paid someone whom I believed to be a solicitor, but it disappeared after I paid them and submitted all the evidence that Home Office requires. I have no energy to carry on. A lot of my friends want to give up because indeed it is hard. But when we begin to lose hope, we see acts of solidarity in practice. We see ordinary people chasing Home Office vans away. We see deportations being canceled because our sisters and brothers are fighting in courts and in the streets. So no matter who or how an asylum seeker finds themselves here in the UK, everyone should be treated with compassion. Let us continue to resist until everyone is free. Let us make us bigger and louder. To the people who have not come here yet, I say solidarity. To people who are here now, I say solidarity. And together, we will win. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for that. Really looking deeply at the the impact of the treatment of the Home Office on migrants and refugees. Yeah, I just heard of someone today who had a 12-month sentence for trying to work, and I thought, what a waste of that person's life and time as they just tried to find economic security in the UK. So thank you for sharing that with us. We'll come back to questions later, but I'd like to move on to Leila now, who'll talk to us about one of the other so-called security issues in the UK, or one of the so-called security policies within the UK and the impact of that on individuals and communities. Sorry, I need to introduce you, I realise. So Dr. Leila Etohaj is Director and Senior Caseworker at Prevent Watch, an NGO that supports individuals who have been impacted by the Prevent duty. She's been directly involved with over 200 of the 660 cases that have been documented by Prevent Watch to date. She co-authored the People's Review of Prevent and the response to the government's own review of Prevent, the Shawcross report, with Professor John Homewood. And she's contributed to a number of articles, UN submissions and reports as an expert in Prevent. So Leila, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just jump right into basically a bit of a background with regards to Prevent, and then how it impacts people more from an individual level rather than a societal level. But when Prevent was introduced in 2003, it was introduced as a way to stop people from being drawn into terrorism, a preventative measure ultimately, and one that sounds very reasonable. Like, if you believe in prevention rather than cure, which most people do, then of course preventing people from committing terror acts is a very reasonable thing to do, and perhaps even something that you would expect every government to ensure for the security of its population. However, the foundations of Prevent, even though they sit within the UK's terrorism strategy, are very different from the other arms of the counterterrorism strategy, in that Prevent is pre-crime. And by that, I mean that it is based purely on profiling individuals and assumes that you can predict a person's future life trajectory, ultimately, based on something they say or behaviors they may exhibit at, age 4 or age 11. And we have had, people call up because they've been referred to Prevent, or their child has been referred to Prevent, and that child is still in nursery. So, any age you could be referred to Prevent, but the younger ages are just highlight and reinforce how ridiculous the policy is, or the duty is. So thinking that you can predict the future based on somebody's thoughts or actions of today, I think is one way in which it really hits home. If anybody walked in and said, I can predict your future, you'd probably laugh them out of the room. But yet we rely on something that's supposed to provide security for the UK, and that is its underlying premise. Again, it may even sound sensible that, if I think that the government is unjust and I have grievances and I speak about wanting to harm people or governments due to my grievances, it might be understandable that you could say, well, actually, you're on a trajectory to potentially committing some kind of criminal act, and you should be prevented from doing so before any of those harms of that act. And that's generally what people think about when they think about Prevent, partly because of its name, Prevent. But Prevent doesn't operate in this space. It operates way before any intention or thought of criminality or anything close to criminality crosses the mind of an individual. And there's no evidence to suggest that those particular signs of radicalization or thoughts are associated with then going on to commit a crime in the future. And these signs are basically signs that millions of public sector workers and even private sector workers have a duty to report on. And these signs end up resulting in many more of our young people and vulnerable people being referred to Prevent. So I'll give some examples of what those signs are. Being wanting to have a sense of belonging, wanting to participate in some kind of political activities, having going through transitional periods, being moody. I think anyone who has a teenager would probably refer them to Prevent now before the end of this session. And it's one of the reasons why over 2,000 of our under 14s are being referred to Prevent every single year. And it's not a statistic that the Home Office are particularly proud about, nor do they shout about, but every year they publish those Home Office statistics and show the number of children referred, but it doesn't hit home because people tend to think of it as somebody else's problem. You know, it's a Muslim problem, it's mainly Muslims being referred, fine. Oh, it's people with really unpalatable thoughts or far-right extreme thoughts. And nobody thinks of it as a problem that could be associated with, you know, innocent people, essentially, because of that smear with, you know, extremism and terrorism, ultimately. So these, you know, Prevent referrals do have real-life consequences on individual lives. And even the fear of a Prevent referral without actually being referred to Prevent in and of itself can stop people and exclude people from participating in society, particularly within politics and democracy, full stop. And we know this because at Prevent Watch, we've documented nearly 700 cases now to date of these individuals impacted by Prevent. And we've seen that, especially, you know, with the current climate, what's happening in Palestine and a lot of the activism around that, what's happening with immigration, Rwanda, everything, you know, as people become more active, they tend to be smeared, especially if they go against the status quo. And that status quo of what determines who is extreme is ultimately defined by whoever government of the day is. And so if you go against whatever the government line is, then ultimately you are equally as other as somebody who might be otherized for their race or religion or their vulnerabilities. Now, referrals made with regards to activism, with regards to children, we've seen, even, you know, since October, we've seen a rise of number of people who have contacted Prevent Watch, and even the chief, I can't remember what his title is exactly, but basically the chief of like counterterrorism has said that there's been an increase in people calling the terrorism hotline since October. He said that there were 70 Prevent referrals that were made since then. Now, we know that as soon as the second week of October kicked in, after the October 7th attacks, you know, there were communications sent to schools, ultimately reminding them of their Prevent duty and telling people that, look, you have to remember that you have a Prevent duty. Hamas is a terrorist organization and you have a Prevent duty. Okay, yes, Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organization in the UK. And yes, you do have a Prevent duty, but it conflates Prevent with people who are actually potentially glorifying Hamas, and that is a crime rather than something that would fall into Prevent and be seen as pre-crime. So it conflates these ideas, and it means that a lot of false and misinformed referrals have been made. You may have heard of a school in East London where parents were protesting outside, and the reason that they were protesting outside was because that school felt emboldened enough to send letters out to parents suggesting that the children who had gone in wearing political colours, not even Palestine flag, but political colours, essentially. So even if they were wearing like green trousers and a red top in block colours representing the Palestinian flag, that this was potentially a sign of extremism, and this may lead to a Prevent referral, and that the adults in the question here, which were the parents of these children, were using their children as political pawns. And the teachers who wrote this letter felt emboldened enough to put out this communication and not even apologise for it once complaints came in. When it comes to others, so obviously I've spoken a little bit about children, you know, all it takes, I guess, is a planting of a seed, and then the rest is up to the imagination of the person who's referring. And this is encouraged by the Prevent industry. I mean, no Prevent officer to date has come forward and said, you know, Prevent shouldn't be abused in this way, because they quite enjoy having that influx of misinformed referrals, because as far as they're concerned, this is an intelligence gathering exercise. And so there's no attempt for them, although they try to distance themselves from it and say, well, this is an educational problem, it's not a Prevent problem. There's no attempt for them to recognize and to rectify this. From an immigration and asylum seeker perspective, you know, it places already vulnerable people in an even more vulnerable place, especially since the latest recommendations that have come into effect this year, actually, by William Shawcross. And those recommendations were to have more Prevent and place it squarely within that immigration space. We know that students, for example, are particularly focused on when it comes to prevent, let alone students who might be on a visa who are already facing quite a hostile strategy when it comes to renewal of their visa, especially if they've been active. Just to end, I'll conclude with these last thoughts, which is, it doesn't happen every day, but this is really the extreme end of it. Many people don't appreciate how damaging being referred to prevent is, because they think, well, so what if a police officer comes and vets you, rather be safe than sorry. But ultimately, all of those referrals are misinformed referrals, even according to the Home Office statistics, because most of them don't progress even under prevent's logic to actually get anywhere for what they would deem as suitable for Channel, which is the de-radicalization program. Now, last weekend, I had a young professional who had been referred to prevent and who couldn't really get anywhere. Firstly, because there's a lack of transparency around it. And secondly, because he didn't even realize he had been referred to prevent when the prevent referral happened. And by the time he had realized, he was out of time limits with regards to taking any legal action with regards to the certain breaches that happened in his particular case. And last weekend, he reached out and said that he wanted to commit suicide because he had been trying to seek justice for so long and just wasn't getting anywhere. There was no accountability, and it's such a difficult and long-winded process that people do feel genuinely at their wits' end, because because prevent is pre-crime, because you haven't actually been suspected of a crime, you sit in a legal limbo space, and sitting in that limbo is worse than even having been suspected or charged with a crime, because at least then you can implement certain safeguards and try to prove your innocence, whereas with prevent you can't. So yeah, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. That's a really great, understanding the background a bit more and that impact on an individual, where it's impossible to have the kind of security that many of us enjoy, being able to seek legal redress. And I hadn't heard of that school in East London, so thank you for sharing that story as well. I have a lot of questions, but obviously I'm going to keep them to the end and allow others to put questions in the chat. We have a few already, so please do continue to put questions in the chat. And next we have with us Reem. Reem is the Racial Justice Campaign Manager at Amnesty International UK, initially focusing on the human rights impact of prevent within the UK. And she's previously worked at the public health charity MedAct on peace and security issues, and comes from a background of campaigning for the rights of marginalised communities, including migrants and people held in immigration detention centres. So Reem is also going to talk to us about prevent, but perhaps give us some more of the broader picture in the UK and the impact within different sectors and the impact on human rights and racial justice. So thank you, Reem, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, let me. Cool. I can actually see the screen bit. Oh yeah. Sorry, I'm still somehow not the best at this. Yeah, so I might cover a bit of the same ground as Layla, but not loads, luckily. So yeah, I am the Racial Justice Campaign Manager at Amnesty UK. And earlier last year, sorry, it's only early January, in November, we published a report called "This is the Thought Police, the Prevent Duty and its Chilling Effect on Human Rights." So obviously, just to say, before this, many organizations, including Prevent Watch, but including many others such as MedAct, for example, had raised the kind of alarm on prevent, and Amnesty's intervention came as seeking to kind of support all of those calls to scrap prevent, in a sense, came to see what we could find in terms of the human rights impacts of prevent, and whether it's justified through using international human rights law. So I'll just tell you what the key findings were of our report. So we found that PREVENT is incompatible with international human rights law, unsurprisingly. It has a discriminatory impact, with Muslims and neurodiverse people disproportionately reported to PREVENT. We crucially found that it has a chilling effect on freedom of speech, assembly, and religion. People reported to us as part of our kind of evidence gathering that they were self-censoring out of fear of being reported to PREVENT or to the police. We found that there's a worrying lack of transparency around PREVENT, so around kind of the evidence base for PREVENT, but also around how, you know, people's data is held, where it's held, how it's shared or whether it's shared, etc. So yeah, as I said, there's a lack of safeguards on data usage for those referred to PREVENT, and that it's very difficult, as Layla kind of outlined, to actually understand and challenge what data is held and where. And we found that there's no evidence that the restrictions on human rights are proportionate and reasonable, let alone that PREVENT itself is actually effective in its kind of alleged mission. So our core recommendations are that government should abolish PREVENT and withdraw the strategy, and rely on pre-existing safeguarding procedures, as well, and including for children facing recruitment to non-state armed groups. We recommend that the government refrain from using overly broad definitions of extremism and terrorism. We recommend that they establish and implement alternatives to the criminal justice system for those accused of terrorism offences, for children accused of terrorism offences. We believe that government should ensure that victims of human rights violations as a result of PREVENT referrals have access to remedy. And we also believe that government should address broader long-term determinants of violence and social harm. So even though government kind of presents PREVENT as this kind of upstream preventative measure for radicalization, we say that they should actually address the determinants of violence and social harm, which aren't at all addressed through the PREVENT duty. And this includes ensuring that public and social services are adequately funded and accessible. We have a few other recommendations, but those were kind of the key ones I picked out. So just to answer like how PREVENT is discriminatory. So statistics have shown that Muslims, for example, are 8 times more likely to be reported under PREVENT. The Jonathan Hall, who's the QC, who was the terrorism legislation kind of czar, says that there's a staggeringly high number of neurodiverse people who are reported to PREVENT, and others within the police and counter-terror have also stated that there seems to be some kind of large social issue in which people who, for example, are autistic are being reported to PREVENT at huge numbers. And just to kind of back up a bit, so some people might think, oh, it's just an impact of unconscious bias, but actually from its inception, national PREVENT funding was allocated to so-called priority areas, and these areas were decided based on the size of their Muslim population. So even though we've moved past that now, nearly over a decade on, those priority areas have only expanded. So those priority areas weren't gotten rid of. It was just more priority areas were created. And so what we found in our report is that there's an over-reliance on professionals, so within schools, hospitals, etc., using their gut instinct. And I just wanted to kind of go into why the use of gut instinct in, reporting, in seeking to identify people who might be at risk of radicalization, why that's an issue and why it's discriminatory. So I'm just quoting here from Dr. Tariq Yunus, who's a psychologist and academic. He says, intuition, however, is subjective and indeed established upon the racial order found within society. If intuition is central to PREVENT, then it's obvious that public policy is susceptible to the prevailing ideologies of British society. So I guess what he's getting at here is that if Prevent relies on individuals' gut instinct or their intuition, who they might think is suspicious, like just thinking of, for example, if you get the tube in London, the whole see it, say it sorted. If you see anyone suspicious, you don't really have any basis for your suspicion. It's better to report them anyway. But of course, who people find suspicious is incredibly, based on their ideas of, on their own subjective ideas of who, for example, is othered. I like to use Layla's terms. And so I just wanted to also show a screenshot from the NHS England like training on Prevent, so safeguarding adults, a guide for healthcare staff. So it says here, one indicator that people should be aware of is grievances. So the examples of grievances that may play an important part in early indoctrination of vulnerable individuals into the acceptance of a radical view and extremist ideology. So again, kind of echoing Layla, the three examples they give is a misconception and or rejection of UK foreign policy, distrust of Western media reporting, perceptions that UK government policy is discriminatory, for example, counter-terror legislation, which is kind of ironic and a bit scary that even, a critical view of counter-terror policy or UK security policy might itself mean that you're, considered to be on the path towards becoming a terrorist. And I just wanted to end on this idea that there's a dichotomy between human rights and security, that these are two things, it's either one or the other. Either you have human rights or you have national security or security. And I just wanted to quote actually initially from the UN. So the UN states, the creation of open, equitable, inclusive and pluralist societies based on full respect for human rights and with economic opportunities for all represents the most tangible and meaningful alternative to violent extremism and the most promising strategy for rendering it unattractive. And I just wanted to end because I'm a bit of an Amadan Group fangirl as well, with the quote from Amadan Group discussion paper. Security is better understood not as the absence of risk, but as the presence of healthy social and ecological relationships. Conversely, policies that serve a state's interests to the detriment of the social and ecological fabric will generate insecurity. So I guess what I want to end on is this sense that actually human rights and the protection of human rights and promotion of human rights is absolutely crucial to the kind of proliferation, sustenance and maintenance of security for all, and that it shouldn't be a case where a marginalized minority, their security is a kind of free for all to be breached at the for the good, for the so-called greater good, but that greater good is very much a subjective, it's an always changing concept, as Layla said, by the government of the day, by the politics of the day. I'll just end there.
Thank you, Reem. That was really helpful, kind of broader picture stuff about about Prevent and its impacts, and a great quote to end on. For those of you who don't know, the Amadan Group and the discussion paper was the origins of rethinking security. So we are where we are today because of that discussion paper. So thank you to all three of you for some really great input. I think it's so helpful to look at the way that security, so-called security, has played out in the UK, and in particular the communities that are targeted. I actually have a question, if it's all right to start. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and so please continue to add those because we have plenty of time. But I did have a question actually for Layla, and I think it might help draw some of the different inputs together. Could you say a little bit more around how the Shawcross recommendations on on people who are migrants to the UK, and a little bit more about what that means and why both these things, this idea of needing to understand people's thoughts and this sort of idea that there's a trajectory towards extremism, and how that's conflated with immigration as a security issue.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because the Shawcross review, one of the reasons why it was so heavily criticized, other than the actual independent reviewer itself, was for the complete lack of evidence that was given to back up any of his recommendations. So his recommendation to apply prevent to immigration relied on the idea that previous people who had committed acts of terror were either immigrants to this country, even if the immigrants were actually their parents or grandparents. So it didn't really matter if they were first, second, or third generation. He almost tried to make this link to the fact that, you know, somebody's come from another country. And so inherently, and this is the idea behind prevent, and this is why it's based on identity, right? Inherently, you have almost like a gene you're just like a waiting, you're a ticking time bomb, essentially, to use that phrase. And so, yeah, so he kind of solidified this link back to immigrants without any evidence as to why this would potentially be beneficial. And also, it underestimates the role that there is a great degree of data sharing that already occurs. And so it's not that people at the border, for example, wouldn't raise any concerns if they felt there was somebody concerning trying to enter the country or, leave the country even. So it underestimates that there already is a role of data sharing that is being applied there. But also it raises really important questions in terms of how it will be enacted. And we haven't seen it being enacted yet properly because those recommendations have just come in January and should be at play now, and we'll get to see how those play out. But it does beg the question that, if somebody is coming to seek asylum in the UK because they have been deemed extremist in their country, what is the UK then going to do? Do they turn them away? Because we already know that there is a problem with this term extremism and how different countries, and there are countries that use it much worse than in the way that the UK is using it, are they then going to be turned away and their life be put at risk? And is this going to be a matter for the international criminal courts to take up? Is this going to be a breach of international law if they're turning people away from asylum? Because the whole point is that they're not safe in their country. And if the government thinks they're extreme, then what would happen if they get turned back?
Thank you. That's really helpful, understanding that, and also that kind of the legal issue or the human rights issue about where do people fit if there's this broad definition of extremism. Lorraine, I don't know if you want to make any comments about that idea that there's some sort of inherent threat in terms of extremism from immigrants, that the security apparatus in this country does that have an impact, do you think, on the way that people are treated with this security mindset as they seek asylum or try to integrate into this country?
I think so anyway, because we've seen a lot of things like tagging systems and all of these things that happen. I think it's all linked to belief that there's a link between asylum and migrants and the security of this country.
Thank you. The tagging system, the criminalization of I suppose bureaucratic discrepancies seems to suggest that there is this fear or idea that somehow migrants occupy criminal space. And I want to come to a question from David Forbes, and he's addressed it to Leila, but I'd like to address it to all of you because it covers, I guess, one of the foundational issues that you all address. What is the best answer to otherization in the UK? It's a big question.
Should I go first?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think one of the answers is basically to stop allowing for our politicians to use this idea of others as a political tool, this idea of fear. I mean, we had David Cameron in 2011, you know, make a speech about the need for immigrants to learn English because they create a discomfort and disjointedness. You know, who's feeling uncomfortable if somebody can't speak English? I mean, the person who potentially can't speak English is probably feeling very uncomfortable because they're trying to go about their daily lives. But this idea that somehow all immigrants come to this country and they're not speaking English and they're not working and they're claiming benefits and, you know, they're stealing our jobs, it plays into that. And I think it plays into this idea of otherization. I think a lot of it comes from lack of awareness, lack of dialogue, maybe between communities, but it really is reinforced from the top down. You know, at one point we had Boris Johnson and Trump, you know, both leaders, you know, leader of the US and leader of the UK at the same time, both reinforcing very racist stereotypes and Islamophobic tropes, as well as many other racist tropes. So, you know, the fact that these people elected is extremely worrying. And I don't think we can allow from top down for that to happen. David Cameron was also the same person who, just touching back on what Ree mentioned about, you know, being seen as extreme if you counter the government's counterterrorism strategy. You know, he wrote a foreword for policy exchange report saying that ultimately anybody who raises concerns and criticisms about the counterterrorism legislation is effectively enabling terrorism. So the fact that you can be an enabler of terrorism just because you raise concerns that people are being unfairly targeted and discriminated against is problematic, and it really reinforces and allows this to be self-perpetuating.
Thank you for that. Reem, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, so I guess like just to remind people and remind this government that all states across the world have an obligation under international human rights law to seek to eliminate racial discrimination. And so, you know, there are, like I know Layla's just spoken about, it seems quite impossible. So for example, under Prevent, one thing that the Home Office every year when they publish their statistics on who's been reported to Prevent, they always celebrate frontline the fact that the far right are, you know, referrals of people who are considered to be or thought to potentially be radicalized to the far right are, you know, increasing. Those referrals are increasing. So how can Prevent be racist if the far right are being captured by Prevent? But what we would say is, you know, how can you be reporting people to Prevent for right-wing views or, you know, far right views when people within our own government are sharing some of these views, when people in our own government and, you know, mainstream newspapers are sharing these views. And then you know, so what we would say is instead, you know, the best way to tackle racism, marginalisation, you know, any form of discrimination and otherization is, tackling on a systemic, institutional, structural level racism, racial discrimination, and, you know, more anti-racist education out there as well. So yeah, that's, you know, something that I think doesn't get enough airtime is the fact that like states do have this obligation, governments do have this obligation.
Yeah, that definitely isn't something that's well known, I think. Thank you. Lorraine, do you want to comment on that, the best answer to otherization, and then we can come to David's other question?
Yeah, I agree with what both have just said. So our politicians, they use divide and rule so that they can get what they want. And there's a lot of scapegoating about refugees and migrants in this country. And then we actually see it where we start becoming suspicious of each other because of the hatred that is sown at the highest level. So I think how we can beat that is, understanding that my struggle is my neighbor's struggle. So working together in solidarity, that's only when we can beat the politicians. Thank you.
Thank you. And solidarity is now one of the key parts of the UN's definition of human security, which I really like. I'm sure they mean probably something a little less radical, but it's still a good concept to come from the UN. But David had another question to you, Lorraine. He asked if you could add something about the fees campaign and the problem of immigration debt bondage in the UK. That's very specific. So I wondered if you could address that quickly, and I think you'd appreciate if David commented as well. So I'll allow him to talk after you've answered that.
Yeah. So yes, earlier there was an announcement by the government to say they will increase the public sector salaries. They will do that by increasing visa fees. So some of us, we saw that as something that is not, it's morally wrong. Migrants are here. The cost of living crisis is affecting everyone else, not just local people. So if they're increasing the visa fees, what will happen to make people more suffer, to make migrants more suffer? So yes, we started the campaign and extortionate visa fees. But I would love David Forbes, if he can come in, because we campaign together on this one, to talk more about the visa fees equals bondage, because it equals debt bondage, because you coined this, David.
So thank you, David. We do have a few more questions to get through, so it'd be great if you could say a little bit now, and if there's any links to go in the chat, also brilliant.
Well, actually, this is about long-term disadvantage of specific groups of people. What they do is to give them the stay. Let's say that it's limited to 2.5 years, and you have to pay massive fees, 2,000. Well, it's going up all the time, over £3,000 per head to renew each time. And if you fall off the ladder, you go back to zero. So some people are going to be long-term marginalized or in the black economy, and other people pay the money, but they have to borrow that money from other disadvantaged people in order to pay the government. So debt bondage is a kind of promise of release from slavery, which can, as in some cases, never arrive. So that's why I see it as being linked to other types of debt bondage which have existed historically and in the present time, and to modern day slavery. So we need to challenge the government for allowing modern day slavery within our systems of immigration at the moment.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, please follow that up in your campaigning if you can. But we have a few more questions, and so most of them are around the response to campaigning on Prevent, either Medac's work, amnesties, and particularly like what does government response look like? What's Parliament doing about it? Maybe Leila Andri might have comments on that, and also a question. I'll just read it out. Am I right in thinking that it is the Prevent issue which makes the Asian people of my hometown hesitant about supporting our solidarity vigil with Palestine? That's from Sylvia Boys, who I think is based in Yorkshire. But maybe let's hear about what Parliament is doing first, how they engage on the issue. I don't know who would like to go first, Reem or Leila.
I can speak quickly to it, and I'm sure Leila also has comments on this. Yeah, so unfortunately, the Labour Party are the party who actually, formed the Prevent strategy initially, and then it was the Conservative government who made it into a duty on all, public and local authorities to implement. So unfortunately, it's a very toxic issue that politicians in general and like political parties don't really want to touch. They don't really want to be seen, because the dominant narrative has really successfully been formed to be, well, Prevent protects our national security, and if you counter Prevent, that means you're a terrorist apologist, or you're enabling, as Layla said, enabling terrorism. It means that it's very hard for politicians or political parties to, publicly criticize Prevent. There have been some public criticisms, so some politicians from the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party have spoken out against Prevent, but it's for the Liberal Democrats, they, as a party, they took a position against Prevent back in like 2017 or 2016. But for Labour, it's very much just, individual MPs who are very much in the minority. We have, since our report was published, Amnesty's report was published, we have had some positive meetings with cross-party MPs on Prevent, but again, it's just unlikely that anyone will be speaking out publicly on Prevent anytime soon, particularly with the general election coming. So we're very realistic about the fact that there isn't likely to be, positive change in this area within Parliament for the, maybe next year or 2 years. But we just believe that it's still very important to ensure that there is kind of a challenge to Prevent. There's like a, grassroots challenge, and also like, widespread public challenge to Prevent. I don't know, Layla, if you have anything to add.
Just to kind of tie in, I guess, that answer with the question, the next question, which was about, the lack of participation of people and whether that was caused by Prevent. It's interesting when you look at the types of exclusion that surround Prevent, involved around, the implementation and just the simple idea of knowing that Prevent exists. And I would say there's maybe two, maybe three, depending on how you look at the last category. But let's say there's three types of exclusion that occur with Prevent and that Prevent reinforces. The first is the exclusion of the person that's referred to Prevent. So somebody gets referred to Prevent, they very much are excluded because they do have that smear, and they will carry that smear of terrorism, even though they haven't even done anything extreme, let alone terror in nature. Okay. So that's the first exclusion. The second exclusion is the exclusion of self, even if you haven't been referred to Prevent. And I think that ties in with the idea that people will hesitate. If your Asian community are hesitating to participate in Palestine, well, of course they are, and they're going to be hesitating in a lot of things, discussions in the classroom. We had actually one of the first Prevent referrals that happened after October 7th. It was literally within the first day that children went back to school, and a young autistic child was referred to Prevent. And it was a completely misinformed referral, and the school recognised that they acted disproportionately in how they referred that child to Prevent. However, what happened when the teacher was going to make that Prevent referral was that he spoke to the mother and he said, this is what your son did. And her response was, oh, I tell him not to speak about anything outside of the home. That teacher took her response as an indication that something must be happening in your home, right? And therefore it reinforced his justification for making the Prevent referral, right? Rather than the lived reality that people they leave their identity at the gates, whether they are students or their parents, and parents are actively discouraging their children from speaking about anything because they are genuinely worried. Whether they know that Prevent exists or not, they know something like Prevent exists. And therefore, so you've got the exclusion of the person referred, you've got the exclusion of self, and then you have the exclusion, and this is going back to the first question that Reem answered just now, the exclusion of those who actually speak up about the matter. So the minute you start speaking up about Prevent, any of its harms, any of the concerns, it doesn't matter how much evidence base you have, that will be shut down and you'll be seen as part and parcel of the problem. And ironically enough, you too are an extremist in your mindset, or, an enabler of terrorism.
It's quite, sorry, Reem.
Just on that point of, is it possible that certain communities, particularly Asian or Muslim communities, are, potentially avoiding going to, any protests they would otherwise go to because of Prevent? Yeah, Prevent could certainly be one reason, or as Layla says, a general fear of being reported to someone, whether that's like being reported to social services, whether that's being reported to the police, even, you know, outside of Prevent. General, fear of criminalization as a result of that kind of intersection of identity, your identity as a Muslim, as an Asian, and your political views, or your political beliefs. So we have the police have themselves stated that there's been a huge uptick in referrals to Prevent since the October the 7th attack. And we've had the education minister, for example, writing to schools, reminding them of their use of Prevent, or reminding them to use Prevent if they're hearing any discussion about what's happening in Palestine, Israel, or any kind of suspicion that a child, and of course here you have to remember that it's much more likely that this child that the teacher might be suspicious of will likely be a Muslim child, or a child racialized as Muslim, to Prevent. And so there is a general fear. And I just want to bring in here like the dimension of immigration again. So for instance, I have Palestinian friends who are in this country on a visa, who themselves, even though the strength of feeling of wanting to attend these protests is so huge for them, they're scared of attending these protests because of, they've seen how people's photos are being displayed by the Met Police on Twitter, or whatever. So that there's this general fear of it's not safe. This, the being able to enact my right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, it's not safe for me as someone with, for example, immigration state, even though they have resident or immigration status here, it's still precarious for them because the government of the day can decide whether to remove those rights for certain people. That's just a kind of a bleak way to end, but yeah.
But thank you, because I think that's so important in understanding the insecurity that people face. Large numbers of people in the country face that kind of insecurity. And I know we're almost out of time, but I'd like to ask all three of you a final question, very quickly, if you can. What would be your priorities for people, for me, for rethinking security, for our members? How can we act in solidarity, as Lorraine has said? What are the things, the priorities to challenge about this kind of community insecurity and exclusion that people face? Lorraine, can you go first?
Yeah, I was thinking, I come from a campaign called Status Now for All. We campaign for people who are undocumented in this country, people who do not have status, asylum seekers, people who have been stuck in the system or outside of the system. So if people can join the campaign, that would be great, but also reaching out to people that are excluded at the moment, because it's a hard life for everyone, but more so for people who are not allowed to access any cash. So together we are strong, let's get united, and we are powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. I've put the Status Now link in the chat. Layla.
I think, there's always been this fine balance between security and liberty. But I think for several years now, the UK has really moved towards justifying these like exceptional restrictions of liberty by presenting this security threat. And I think firstly, just educating ourselves that this is part of fear-mongering. And, what these politicians are doing are exceptionalizing, firstly, a threat that isn't novel, and secondly, a threat that isn't as high as you would be led to believe if you were running off of what the politicians were saying and what the mainstream media reports were saying. I think I'm quite hopeful in our young generation, and I think we need to take a leaf from their book, definitely, and let them lead the way almost, because I think although there's a changing political landscape, we don't have much hope that anything is going to change with regards to Prevent amidst that political landscape. But I do think that the next government, as well as this government, has underestimated the clarity and political awareness of our next generation who are so much more confident in demanding their full rights, rather than having this mindset of gratitude and this idea that they're somehow second-class citizens and are just happy to be invited to the table, let alone expect a crumb to fall their way. And that really gives me hope. And I think, supporting our youth and just educating ourselves as well as them.
Thank you. Yes, that's great. Thank you. Reem, have you got a final thing that we can do?
Yeah, I would say, just echoing everything that's been said already, I think connecting up struggles is really, really important. So, I'm really grateful that we have me, Lorraine, and Layla all here today, because the struggles for people with immigration status or are not unconnected to the struggles of people who are kind of othered and racialized and criminalized for their race or their beliefs. And so connecting up struggles in whatever campaigning that you do, and also just for example, knowing that there might be people in your community or the people in your neighborhood or whatever who are facing this kind of this huge mechanism that exists within all institutions, which is Prevent, and just be maybe cluing yourself up on how can I actually support that person, how can I support that family who've maybe had their child referred to Prevent, or is there anything I can do within my community, within my neighborhood, to support people. So I guess that principle of solidarity, I think that. And thank you so much, Jo, as well.
Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for your contributions tonight and answering the questions. We're just over time now, so I'm going to have to wrap up. And apologies to the people who put questions in the chat, but we haven't been able to answer them directly. Yes, thank you so much to Layla, Reem, and Lorraine. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you, and like you say, Reem, to connect up these issues and think about so-called national security and its impacts on communities within the UK. Our final webinar in the series is on Wednesday, the 7th of February, and that will be looking at individual security, covering issues like economics, health, gender equality, and how that kind of completes our picture about what it means to implement an alternative kind of security. So hope to see most of you then. And enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for joining us.